The Winchester Lee is a pretty interesting rifle that not many people get to handle or shoot, and I'm lucky enough to have gotten one of these and even shoot it. So I'd really like to point out some things I've noticed haven't been discussed much or at all online about these guns, and that I've noticed while handling them, as well as just show a nice quick look at the internals and how it works, as there isn't much out there on this gun. As a brief introduction, these rifles were adopted by the U.S. Navy for a short period of time, around the same time the Army used the Krag-Jorgensen series of rifles. They were submitted and designed by James Paris Lee of the Lee Enfield fame, and chambered in 6mm Lee Navy, or 236 USN, as is the more proper but less known name. There were around 20,000 of these rifles made by Winchester, first 10,000 in the first Navy contract, 5,000 of civilian and non-contract military sales, and then a final 5,000 contract to Navy. Of the around 5,000 non-contract and civilian sales, the vast majority were civilian, split between two types of rifles. First, the civilian muskets, which were the same as the Navy rifles, although I think they did have the shorter barrel, and obviously no Navy markings. The second, the sporting rifles, were just sporting rifles. There were around 1,500 of those produced, and this is one of them. And this is what we're going to take a look at today. Functionally, it is still identical to all the Navy models. On the rear left side of the receiver, you can see three obvious standout buttons or controls. You've got your safety, your bolt release, and your actual bolt stop. The safety is activated and deactivated just by sliding it up and down. And something to note about the safety is, even though it clicks like this is not the safety actually engaged. The safety must be almost flush with the top of the receiver to engage, and when it does so, a roller inside of the receiver pushes up and pushes the firing pin back, so it is no longer engaged by the sear. You can see this as the firing pin will move back forward once the safety is disengaged. Really simple. When the bolt is closed and the firing pin is cocked, the bolt is locked, so you cannot bring it to the rear. If you do not wish to drop the firing pin, you can simply push the release, and the bolt will lift up by the spring tension, and you can open the weapon. The actual bolt stop itself is a simple flat spring that you simply push to the left of the receiver and push down. This moves a block inside of the receiver that would normally prevent the extractor, and thus, by extension, the bolt from being able to come out of the receiver. Something I would like to talk about is slamming this closed, and that's because this is both a cock-on closed weapon and it is a cam action that requires the bolt to be cammed down and engaged with a locking surface built into the receiver. Now, because of that, you need to close this with a good bit of force to get it to actually really seat and close. Otherwise, you'll just end up looking like an idiot trying to push it like this. You'll see this in a lot of the videos of it. Now, what I realized is, I don't know if this is on purpose or not, but this locking flap, or this flap on the left side of the bolt here, if you close this by hand, you can quite easily push forward and then push down, and it will close without you needing to slam the firearm. This is really nice for a reason I'm going to talk about in a second. You can see, by the way, the firing pin rather staying in place as the bolt moves forward and locks. Bolt stop down. All you need to do to take it out of the firearm is simply pull back and be mindful of the floating extractor. This is not attached to the bolt in any way. The extractor on this gun actually does a lot more than just extract. It also acts as the feed lips that stop the cases. There aren't any actual feed lips in the magazine. You simply push the extractor aside and drop your round below. It actually acts as a bolt stop, because if you look in the receiver here, you can see that when I bring the bolt stop up, it actually gets in the way of the channel for the extractor, and you can see how the extractor just slides along in there. Got this gun, before I was able to fire it, I was manually testing the Buffalo Arms cartridges I got, as 6mm Lee Navy has not been produced since like the 1930s or 1940s. As such, brass has to be reformed from other cases. In their case, they use 25-06. Most people do 220 Swift. But I realized that the rounds would not go into the chamber at all. They were stopping probably about here at the chamber mouth. I was sticking way out. And when I pulled it out, there were two large burrs on the case, like very large, just gouged out. I didn't know why until I looked at the actual chamber mouth. Quality isn't good, but you can see there are two significant dimples at the edges of the extractor cut at the chamber mouth, basically. What had happened was the edges of the extractor, I assume from dry cycling, ended up creating two significant burrs that were gouging the cases as I was just trying to hand chamber them. I ended up carefully removing these using polishing stones, but I thought that was just a fluke that might have happened to my rifle. What I later did, though, is I was looking at the pictures from the aftermath of the detonation of Robert Louis' Winchester Lee, unfortunately. In one of those pictures, you can clearly see one of the fired cases in his hand, and you can see marks from where that extractor cut would have been relative to the case. I don't know if this would have affected it at all, but I think it's something that should be noted when dealing with these firearms. I'm going to strip the bolt first, but this is how the extractor just simply sits on the bolt itself. It just slides along with these bolt stops, or extractor stops, and there's a cutout here, so that way when the bolt cams, it can lock in right there. An interesting sort of side effect is this is when you are unlocking the bolt and then pulling it rearward, the bolt face is well clear of the cartridge before the actual extractor starts to pull it clear of the chamber. Assembling the bolt itself is really easy. This is actually part of the firing pin right here. All you have to do is you push the firing pin back and you move the cocking handle forward so that this half moon is no longer engaged. Now that that's done, all you have to do is sort of push and wiggle, and the actual cocking handle, camming handle, will come off. And you can see that's quite an interesting bit of machining. Not an easy piece to replicate. After this, the firing pin will easily come right out with its captive spring. The bolt itself is now completely stripped. And if I can get this to focus right, I don't know if I'll have much luck. Well, you can see this is the firing pin, even if it's a bit fuzzy. The spring actually screws on through a little gap at the front there, if I can get that to focus. That's about as good as I'm going to get. The shroud is captive on the firing pin. It's pretty tight. And interestingly enough, the spring is actually indexed to it. You can see that right there. Once again, not a very simple shape to remake. The rifle itself is pretty easy to disassemble. You just got one screw here, one screw here, and of course one for the barrel. I would like to point out, by the way, that this rifle stock has been refinished, and someone must have attempted to cold blue the actual barrel as well. You can see the original bluing once I take the stock off, though. Both now out of the stock. Here's the quite unique trigger geometry. You can see we have a flat spring here, a very fancy spring here, and the actual sear right here. You can also see a very nice view of the elevator for the magazine. That is powered by a simple coil spring right here. The rifle itself, I'm not going to disassemble much further, but basically the gist of it would be you'd pull this down and then just slide this all out. You'd pull out this little block here, and from there you would twist and otherwise manipulate to easily get these two pieces out. Very easily the line between what was exposed and what was not. The bluing on the underside is fantastic, but above, not so much. Forgotten about this rifle is although you can load the magazine by hand, there were actually disposable n-block clips of cartridges that you were supposed to use basically exclusively for loading the rifle. And these look deceptively like stripper clips, and I've got a reproduction one by S&S Firearms right here. But what they are is just a simple metal clip that holds, the cartridge rims, and then a wire spring with a loop. And if you look closely, you'll notice that this is actually flat. It's got a flat edge. Let's see if I can get this in focus. There we go. You can see flat edge. What's supposed to happen is you would have your piece of wire in the clip right here, and they would normally be like this specific orientation. The reason for that is you can see how the wire, or maybe not, you can see how the wire, the flat portion is sticking up. Now that's sticking up too far. I can't actually get these stripper clips or end blocks to work correctly right now. I need to basically fit them. But that would put tension on the rims against these little track guides here. So that would keep all your cartridges in position. What happens is you take your end block with all your cartridges and you would put the whole thing in as close to the bolt face where the bolt was open. The rounds would get on here on the follower, and the clip itself would go behind into here. What this has, so you can see there's a wedge there, and then there's a track. So what that does is once this little loop here gets in that track, it's forced to go, well, if I can get it. There we go. It's forced to go flat. Then there would be no tension on the cartridges, and the clip would fall out within short order, while the rounds would be pushed up by the follower. The clip would just fall out of the bottom, and it's disposed of. Something I'd like to point out is this is the locking surface on the inside of the receiver. Quite a big surface. And this is the corresponding surface on the bolt right here. You can see it's pretty sizable. All we do is take our firing pin, carefully stick it back in here with the spring still captive. You can see that in the hole here there's a specific spot that has to be lined up, and really that's just as far forward as it can go. You then take your charging handle and sort of wiggle it in, and then the last step is to make sure it's in position again. Back together again here so we can see everything going on this time. See the trigger pull down, interact with that bolt release. This is the other side of the bolt release right here, and you can see it sort of interact. So once we get the bolt started, and I'll try and close this without getting in the way. You can see the back of the firing pin right there being held up. So when we pull the trigger, you should see it drop, as well as the rear go back into the bolt as it flies forward. And as you see, with the firing pin dropped, there isn't any spring pressure, well, like when you release the bolt manually. So instead of springing up, you simply pull it back yourself. Bolt closed and locked. We'll unlock it manually using the button. Oops. You can see how far back the bolt gets before the extractor actually starts to pull on the case. This is just a spent case, and it's just flung out by the force of the spring. And then you can see how it's acting as the actual feed lips. And then you'd go, and obviously if it had a bullet it would guide properly, but it doesn't. Again. So the gun will literally not function without its extractor. It won't have a bolt stop, it won't have feed lips, it won't extract. The bolt will not actually move properly in the action because it helps guide it. It really is something that's crucial on these guns.